This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, welcome to episode 144 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, Splashtop. Splashtop offers on-premise, self-hosted remote access and remote support solutions for companies who prefer to have their software installed behind their firewall for increased security and control. Companies can remotely access and support any device, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, and even Internet of Things devices. Splashtop Enterprise users remotely access and support not only their laptops and desktops, but also kiosks, point-of-sale terminals, and much, much more. Splashtop integrates with Active Directory for identity access management, making it easy to deploy and maintain. Splashtop has high security standards and is the remote support tool of choice for many companies globally. I've been using Splashtop for 7 years and highly recommend it. Use it both personally and in our enterprise. So definitely check it out. You can get a free month trial and 20% off at ageekleader.com/splashtop. Again, that's ageekleader.com/splashtop. SPLASHTOP. ageekleader.com/splashtop for a free trial and 20% off. Hey, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, I've got Diana Wu Davis. She's the author of a book called Future Proof, Reinventing Work in an Age of Acceleration. And one of the things I really like about this book and about the things that we're going to be talking about today is that a lot of times in development and in engineering and in management even, we figure out that we're really good at one thing, and sometimes that skill changes in our future, and we're not exactly sure how to go to the next level. If we should go to the next level, what's our next step in life and in our careers? And I think this book really helps address that for people that are just starting out or people that are at my level in the career as well. So, Diana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John. I'm really looking forward to it.
If you don't mind telling the audience just a little bit about kind of how you got to where you are and where you are now in your career and in your life, and just to lay some context for our conversation today.
I think if you go back to when I first started out in the workforce, I came knocking. I actually got my first job out of a classified ad at the back of the New York Times, just to let you know how old I am. And I started working for Henry Kissinger as my first job out of school. And since the subsequent 2 decades have been making sense of disruption and sort of managing disruption, I was just a lowly assistant for his office and for him. And the first automation, which I talk so much about now, that I did was taking the Boy Scout letters that he would send to all the Eagle Scouts and taking them from being done on a typewriter one by one to actually putting them on the computer and printing them out and changing the name and then having them sign individually each one. So it goes back a long way.
Wow. Some people might not even know what a typewriter is, but I met the guy that founded Red Hat, and he used to sell typewriters. He was a door-to-door typewriter salesman.
If it's not one thing, it's another. And I've been on panels where, the head of Google in Hong Kong asked us, what's your first job and what did it teach you? And her first job was as a gas station attendant in Australia. So you never know. It's always, you have to be ready for that question. But
I don't think I've ever told people what my first job was, but it was at Arby's.
What's your first job?
I worked at Arby's making sandwiches.
That is so funny. I love that. So since then, forward 2 decades, I went to business school and became that person that a lot of the tech people look at as the translator. Not somebody. I did code in Emacs way back in the day when we were first starting out websites, but went into consulting and venture capital, have worked for startups, and lastly in a corporate job, and really just always making sense of disruption. So, trying to figure out how what's happening in the present or in the future will apply to change your business and your life, and how you can prepare for that. So I live in Hong Kong now, and I have my own company and largely spend my time with companies, trying to help them look at signals for the future and prepare for it. And with Future Proof, the book, and my classes for business school and for my online course, Future Proof, help people prepare for the future, for their careers and for their lives.
So, do you think things are moving faster now than they used to move? I mean, it's really a perspective on time and innovation is really difficult for me because I feel like it is. I just feel like things, when I look at my, 20 years ago, what life was like, and then if you start back from 20 years ago, what was it like 20 years from there, and then 20 years from there, I feel like this last 20 years has changed a whole lot more. What do you think?
Absolutely. I have a great visual for that, which actually shows the different drivers, which are a part of my book. One is the fact that things are moving faster. So technological innovation, business model paradigm shift, those things are coming out much more quickly. And you can see it, so many ways to Sunday where the steam engine came in, the 1800s or whatever, and then like 100 years later, the next innovation. Whereas now we have upgrades on a fairly constant basis. And meanwhile, we're living longer, right? So it's like, when you kick the bucket at 50, then you don't have as much time to deal with the paradigm shift. But now that we're all going to live to be 100, you really, in your career even, have to think, oh gosh, I just figured out and mastered, Python. So like, now what do I do? In the past, you could have just said, that's it. That's my thing. That's my thing for my big 30-year career. Now you got to think, A, it's changing more quickly, and B, that even just the applications that you can use with Python have massively changed over a period. So I do think it's going more quickly, and there's just more. If it's tech, that's one thing, demographics, and the other one is globalization. So, back in the day, we didn't have to think about whether or not there was a team in India doing something in parallel, or that we might even have to work with. So that just adds a level of complexity to it.
Yeah, and global communication. I mean, I was just telling someone yesterday, you remember 40 years ago, if you wanted to communicate with someone, you wrote them a letter and you put it in the mail, and then you waited, for it to get there. And if it was somebody in Europe, it could be a week or more before it gets there. And now you just pick up your phone and you're having a live, HD quality face-to-face conversation with them. Yeah,
it is truly amazing. And, and travel as well. And in fact, I was on the way to the U.S. where my parents live. I stopped off in L.A. and saw a new stealth startup that's doing XR, and they're focused on presence. And in fact, I had my kids with me, and so one of them went in the other room, and we could pass a ball back and forth, and without gloves, without any kind of goggles. You could feel the presence of their hand and the ball going back and forth. So I think that, it's only going to get more like that, this crazy connection that you have with people regardless of where they are in the world. And it's changing the way that we relate to each other.
Yeah, that's just crazy. Technology is like
so
mind blowing.
Cool.
How quickly everything's going, and and also I was watching a history documentary. I forgot some docuseries I saw on the History Channel when they were talking about how this guy's gonna he's gonna take over his dad's company. They're gonna be doing the same thing his dad did, just like his grandfather did, just like his grandfather did. I'm like, well, that doesn't happen anymore. Nowadays the jobs that my dad had don't exist because there's new jobs that didn't exist when he was there that have taken over those jobs, and it's like. The career landscape has just changed completely, and I guess we have to learn to prepare for that and to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what are some things that we can do to help us think about the future and where our career may be going or where our job may be going in the future?
Well, I think that technologists are probably better at this than some other career folks, but. One of the things that I had feedback on from the first Future Proof course that I ran was the idea of futures thinking and the idea of making it a practice to think about where your industry or where your specific job function is heading. So to give an example from my life, I've spent quite a lot of my life in media. So I worked at Time Warner Electronic Publishing when we were doing CD-ROMs and broadband content. And I've worked for different media companies and telcos and consulting. And I worked for Financial Times newspaper a media company, truly, but for a 10-year period across Asia. And so really, I knew that the strategy for that going forward was going to be massively different. Like I have always been in a sort of, or tried to be in a sort of profit and loss strategic position, and understanding that, fundamentally the revenue that we relied on was shrinking and we needed to find other ways to engage with our customer. That was really important. It's one of the things that led me to launch an education, sort of executive education initiative for the Financial Times. And I still teach there because, people are not going to want to read a newspaper going forward, but they still fundamentally want information to make better decisions for their business and for their lives, for their careers in particular. So that kind of forward thinking, that kind of looking at, okay, I'm in, for example, I just was in Shanghai speaking to a travel company and, forecast the future of travel for them so that they could have interesting conversations about, will people still have meetings if XR becomes so prevalent that it's just like being in the same location? What will happen when hypersonic jets make a trip from Tokyo to San Francisco 5 hours and you can go for lunch and be back to put your kid in bed? That kind of like almost, writing the crazy headlines from 10 years from now and then thinking, am I prepared for that? And what kind of preparation do I need in order to be prepared for that? And then I guess the big thing for me is taking small bets to experiment and reinvent yourself and perpetually upgrade. So when the iPhone comes out, everything isn't completely different, but there's usually one or two things, around the margin that the camera's better, or, where they put that annoying little whatever the before AirPods, the annoying place where you charge. They changed the chart.
They got rid of the earphone.
Your earphones, yeah. So think about yourself in the same way. When you think about, okay, you mentioned you were coding in COBOL for 10 years. Thinking about like what small thing could I do that I could test? It may be that you try it and you go, you know what, that was awful. I hate that. I got to try something else. Or it may be an investment in more transferable skills because things are changing so quickly. So I teach interpersonal communications at the business school in Hong Kong. And that I think is a huge investment, right? When are you going to, no matter if you're doing your first tech job or you're like me on the board of a robotics education startup, you still got to like work with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's stuff you can actually work to improve. So those kind of investments are really important.
Yeah, I actually had a student, I teach part-time at Winthrop University as well, and I had a student a couple years ago say something like, I asked him why he wanted to go into application development, and he goes, well, I like to work with code and computers, but I don't like people. I said, well, you're picking the wrong career, because that's all you're going to do is work in teams of people and get requirements from people and deliver products to people, and that's what a developer does.
Yeah, it's really important. And, it's changing too. I talk a lot about virtual teams to my MBA students now because they truly have to learn how to develop great relationships very quickly for their project teams and fast trust, how to work with people who they may not be sitting right next to them, which is actually really hard. I've run teams across Asia, and when you have somebody right next to you, and I'm one of those terrible bosses that just blurts stuff out and hopes that you're catching it, and but you really have to invest in the relationships and building a relationship with somebody that's not sitting right next to you and asking them about their day and taking that time and getting to know what kind of style they have. So maybe you've heard of the personal user manual. Have you heard of that?
No, what is that?
The personal user manual is something that came out, it's not my idea, but I made my business school students do it. And it is basically the same way that you have, a manual for when you unbox your computer or electronics. Or Lego for that matter, you have a manual. This is how it works. This is how it works best. This is what, when it's sluggish, this is what it might mean. And so I have them do a personal user manual that basically says, this is my preferred work style. This is how I behave under stress, but, don't take it personally. This is the kind of socialization or socializing that I really enjoy, be it like karaoke or quiet coffee in the morning, et cetera. And it's sort of how you work with people. And it's just so helpful. So some of the companies I work with or the teams will do this and they'll put it on the share drive for everybody else to see. And then when a new person comes in, they can look at it and write their own. And it actually really improves communications. And it's just a fun way to do it, to do a personal user manual for yourself to improve team dynamics.
So how would you roll that out to your group to because you don't want to say, oh, this is mandatory, everybody has to do it and kind of make it a boring task. You want to make it something fun and exciting that everybody wants to do. How would you go about rolling that out in a way that's adopted really well and something that everybody takes heart and takes a hold of?
Well, I think that it's helpful if it comes from somebody who's the team lead because everybody worries, oh gosh, is this going to be cheesy? Am I going to say too much about it? So you need one person to say, for example, if you're the team lead, would it be helpful to you guys if I told you the best way to work with me? Would you guys like to know how it's easiest to get a yes from me, for example? So a lot of the executives that I know have done this. The CFO of a large company that I talked to basically said, look, guys, I don't need you to spend 4 hours working on a perfect presentation for me. I'd much rather you take the time and, show me something that you've worked on for half an hour and get my feedback first. And so part of it and the incentive behind it is often save time, reduce miscommunication. And once you have that, then you really can start to roll it out on a wider basis. Rolling it out with a smaller team that already trusts each other enough to do that, I think is quite nice. My MBA students said that they had done it in particular with their teams, and their teams loved it. But it was helpful to have the team lead take that position first to give a good example and maybe to show some vulnerability.
Yeah, I think that's always important for the team leader to go first. I asked my daughter years ago when I was giving my first leadership talk. I think she was 4 or 5 at the time. I said, "So what's a leader?" And she's like, "Well, that's the person in front when you're going to get water from the water fountain." I was like, "Oh, you're right. The leader has to go first, right? They have to try it out first. They have to kind of put themselves out there and be the first one to make the mistake if there's a mistake, or to be vulnerable, to put themselves in front." So yeah, I absolutely agree with that 100%. So what are some other things that we can do when we're thinking about, being ready for the future? We have those ideas of testing out, and upgrading our operating systems by trying different things and seeing what we like and what we don't like. Are there any things we can be doing on an ongoing basis or with other people to try to build that rapport and accountability?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them is really to get quite clear on your own why. We were talking about Simon Sinek before, and really understand what some of your drivers and values are. So in Future Proof, the book, I have a couple of different resources and encourage reflection to think about what is, there's the sort of where you're going, which is the lighthouse you're rowing towards. It doesn't have to be super strong goal. It just has to be, what you're hoping to focus on. So it could be storytelling, becoming better at, telling stories, or it could be being a connector, connecting with people. It could be impacting the world via your technology, whatever it is. So I think that that's quite good because you can tell people your why, and it gives them a sense of who you are. And then in terms of the connecting, getting a sense of your strengths that lead to that why. So there's so many things you can do now. There's Gallup Strengths Finder, which allows you to understand, or VIA, which is a character survey, or Imperative, which is to help you identify your purpose and whether or not it's a sort of systems level or corporation or individual. And I'm happy to send you all the links for those. But
yeah, we've had Tom Rath on talking about strength finders before.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think that's very helpful. I went through the process to identify my strengths, and I think for probably almost a year afterwards, I had those taped to my door, so anybody that came up would see what those strengths were to try to help that communication path. I think that was very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, self-awareness is an underrated concept.
And it's a hard thing, really, to be self-aware, because sometimes you don't have that mirror looking back at you. You don't have that mentor that can tell you the things that are wrong, because a lot of times you see things through a different lens than everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes a team strong. It's kind of what makes you strong. But we forget that not everybody looks to people in that way. So, I think that the other thing that I found, and maybe it's useful, is that trust is something that is really at a low point in corporations and government. I think the Edelman Trust Barometer puts most different, in particular, since it's you guys, in particular the trust in technology companies, and technology in general. That's something that I think we have to work on. And there is a fabulous book by Stephen Covey Jr. on the speed of trust.
Yes. I've went through that program, the training program for that. Yeah, that's a great book.
I use it with senior leaders and board directors all the time. We actually have adapted that for a multicultural environment, because trust is different depending on, where you are and depending on the circumstance. And with all these new trends towards agile technology and towards, going into a team and working quickly, and then teams reforming for different projects, it's interpersonal communications. And frankly, you mentioned that they were soft skills. I'm going to call them alpha skills.
Mm-hmm. I like that better.
There you go.
Because they're not easy. They're not soft. They're hard.
No, they're super hard. And you can only become a master at your craft if you can master those skills, frankly. That's the only way you get to the top for most things, unless you found some way to be the guy who sits in a room, doing mad scientist experiments or whatever. But even then, right, who's going to know about you unless you can articulate what it is that you're doing and what's important about it? And networked science is becoming a huge thing now for all the same reasons that we talked about with the globalization and whatnot. People don't solve problems in isolation. They probably never did, but
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's one of those things where people, you think about the one guy that's sitting in his basement and came up with a tech company that was worth $1 million, but it's very rarely that it's one guy. It's usually 3 or 4 guys sitting in the basement coming up with it, and it's not something that happens overnight. It's usually an idea that is fleshed out and bounced around and iterated upon many times, usually over a couple of years before the first prototype comes out that may or may not be successful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I agree. I don't trust tech companies either, and I work in tech. And I don't trust a lot of the stuff that we build, because there's always flaws. There's things that people don't realize, that they don't even understand the ramifications of what they're doing. There's so many unintended consequences from information that's collected and gathered. And it's growing faster than I think regulation and human experience can keep up with it.
John, do you know what's so fascinating? I don't know if any of your geek leaders are in China, but the attitude towards technology and privacy in China is so different. People are like, great, bring on the tech, and happy to share our information and our locations and our financial information and all of that. It's really interesting to see how popular and how much esteem Alibaba, for instance, in China has, or Tencent, versus in the United States. So I think that that's going to be a trend worth watching in the future, because what will that attitude have in terms of the development of tech companies around the world, but in particular in the U.S. and China? I think it'll be really interesting to watch.
No, so let me ask you about you've traveled all over the place and seen lots of different cultures, and is part of that because of the government influence in China? Because I know that social media is different over there. There's a lot of things that are different as far as the censorship, and does that come into play at all?
Well, I think that the government is perceived as backing technology, and there's a lot of national pride around some of these companies because they drove China's rise. Mm-hmm. And at least, not necessarily, just economically, but sort of on the world stage, the profile that China has in terms of how it's going to be the AI leader, in the same way that JFK said, we're going to put a man on the moon. China is a young country who, well, it's a very old country, but it's sort of newly rising, I would say, and talking about the idea of, being the leader in AI. And I think that there's part of it, the trust, or part of the willingness to do that, is every citizen feels like they want to see that future. They want to see a future where China is dominant in AI, because then it will be dominant in the world. And part of it is, you're right, that there's not a proliferation of different companies. It is really fairly government controlled. So there is a sort of overarching I guess, master to all of that. Mm-hmm. They're so big that it's really difficult to think of that. Whereas in the U.S., the tech companies are way ahead of regulation, and certainly there's a sense that they're doing things for the benefit of themselves.
Yeah, I was also thinking maybe it's because their government actually understands tech,
and
I think
ours doesn't. That it is just. What's that?
I said maybe it's because their government understands technology and maybe ours doesn't.
Well, it's just command and control. And so that, there's a lot of problems with that, but it works well to coordinate technology companies.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree 100%. So what advice would you have then if we realize that maybe we're not doing some of these things, we need to start doing these things, and we know why we need to do these things now. We know kind of what our why is, what we want to do, and what we see as our future and our, if you will, legacy. And we're starting to see the way that we're starting to get that self-awareness. We're starting to build that stuff up. What is our next first step? Like, what is that first thing that we need to do, the small thing that we need to start to make the big change?
I've been asked that a number of times, and actually put together a checklist, which awesome. Is at bit.ly/prepare for future. Mm-hmm. And I'll send you the link as well. But it was, it's 11 questions to help you prepare for the future. And you'll be surprised, because I spend a lot of time looking at technology. But the questions are things like whether or not you have a strategic network of people, because that will make you resilient if you lose your job. And it will ensure that as professional loyalty flows horizontally now, instead of just up the corporate ladder or down the corporate ladder, you have more resilience. You have de-risked your work and your career. And some of it's things like, the latest technologies. Others of it is things like you have relationships so that when things go poorly, you have people to fall back on. So you might be surprised, and it's really just yes/no answers to 11 questions, and wherever the gap is, you start there.
Awesome. No, I think that's great. That's pretty cool. So I just went to that link. I'm going to link that up in the show notes as well, so people can get that from geekleader.com. That link will be there, so you can go right to those checklists. But in those checklists, you have things like values. You talk about you know what your values are. I think that's very important, and that's something that a lot of people don't write down and don't think about. What are some ways we can come up with what our values really are?
So I have a number of resources that I've used over time. First of all, I think that you need to just check in and spending time to reflect on, for instance, how did the year go? What did I like about it? And then also having time to reflect when you felt like things were really working, the high points in your life. Those are some of the times you can look back on and say, yeah, I really like that. And maybe it's because you were in a great team. And so one of your highest, values could be working with people on work that matters. And some of it could be, for me, being able to make an impact with my stories and strengthen communities and build communities through the stories we tell each other is hugely important. And I think that making that time to reflect and connect it is important. And you don't really have to have a lot of frameworks for that. I have a lot of frameworks in my book. I have a lot of frameworks in my Future Proof course, because it just helps people to start and it helps people look at it in different ways. But truly just taking 3 hours on a Saturday, once a quarter and saying, all right, where am I going? Is this okay? Does this resonate with what I feel is, right? Is it making me become the person I want to become? Which is probably the most important question. It's not about goals per se. It's about, is this making me the person that I want to become?
No, I think that's one of the questions that we really need to ask is how is this changing us, and is this going to get us to where we want to be? And who we want to be.
Yeah, there's a wonderful TED talk that's only about 4 minutes. I can link to it for you as well. It's Eulogy versus Resume Virtues by David Brooks. And, he does talk about the fact that when they write your eulogy, they're not going to be saying, and she got an A+ from blah, blah, blah university, and, that's why we liked her. And it's really about the kind of person that you have become and the kind of relationships you formed and the kind of impact that you made, but frankly also that you just wanted to make. What was important to you? And, maybe you didn't get all the way to where it was, but the fact that you wanted to in the first place is the person that you became.
That's awesome. So, your book, Future Proof, can you give us why should we run out and buy this book today, and how can we get it?
So, Future Proof, Reinventing Work in the Age of Acceleration, is a book that will help you prepare for the future, and it's incredibly actionable. So I just talked to somebody, and he said, this is the most notes I've taken in the margin of any book.
Wow. That's a great feedback.
Yeah, I was very touched by that. And I have had so many people who come up and say, I've really been dissatisfied and not really sure where to start, but I read your book, and I feel like I got 3 things that I can start doing right now. When I wrote the book, honestly, that was one of the sort of KPIs. I was like, when people read this book, they're going to go, okay, I'm going to do A, I'm going to do B, I'm going to do C. And frankly, have a feedback loop to see how that worked, and then go on to, the next DEF. And that's one of the reasons I launched a Future Proof course, because people were saying, I want to do this. I'm excited. I'm motivated, but I want to do it together with other people. So that's why we started our online course and community. And I do, on my mailing list, even do free master classes for people to upskill, because that's kind of my why. I feel so passionate about helping other people make the impact in their lives and create meaning in their lives. So yeah, you can pick it up on Amazon. That's probably the easiest way, and it's online in ebook format and also in paperback. And yeah, if you want to download the first 2 chapters, those are on my website as well, dianawoodavid.com.
Nice. Awesome. I'm going to link all that up in the show notes, link to your book, as well as your website and your course as well. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Greatly appreciate it, and keep doing great work.
Thanks, John. It's so lovely to talk to you.
Hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with Diana, and if so, please head over to Twitter and share it with a friend. Also, I would love it if you would leave a rating and review in iTunes, or Apple Podcasts as they call it these days. That's where I get a lot of motivation, and I read those things, and it really is encouraging to see new ones come out. So please leave a rating in Apple Podcasts. If you're not sure how to get there and how to do that, go to agleader.com/subscribe and click on the icon right there, and you can go right through the steps to leave a rating and review. That'd be greatly appreciated. Also, I want to thank our sponsor of the show, Splashtop. And again, you can get a free month trial as well as 20% off if you go to geekleader.com/splashtop. And again, they have for some of the best remote support tools as well as remote access. Great tool. Check it out at geekleader.com/splashtop.